Louisiana, August 18th, 1847, 3 a.m. Caleb Bogard grabbed the 14-year-old girl by her hair and slammed her against the cabin wall. She didn't scream anymore. She had learned not to scream. Her small hands clawed at the wooden planks, fingers bleeding, eyes fixed on the door no one ever came through. Then the door opened. A woman in a white nightgown stood frozen in the doorway. Charlotte Bogard, the senator's wife, had just seen everything. And Caleb's eyes turned to ice. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. There are places in this world where secrets do not merely hide, they live. They breathe inside the walls of old houses. They move through the hallways at night when everyone else is pretending to sleep. They sit at the dinner table with the family, quiet and well-dressed, and nobody dares look them directly in the eye. The Bogard plantation was that kind of place. It sat along the western bank of the Mississippi River, about 12 miles outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. From a distance, it looked like every other grand estate of the antebellum South. White columns catching the afternoon light, magnolia trees lining the long gravel road to the front entrance, the smell of honeysuckle drifting across the fields on warm evenings. But the people who lived and worked inside that plantation, they knew better. They had always known better. Charlotte Whitmore Bogard arrived at the estate in the spring of 1841 as a 23-year-old bride from Richmond, Virginia. She was educated, graceful, and deeply sheltered from the brutalities that plantation life in Louisiana could produce. Virginia had its own sins, she would later admit, but what she found in Louisiana was something different, something heavier. Something that pressed against your chest before you even understood what it was. Her husband, State Senator Edward Bogard, was 15 years her senior. He was tall, composed, and spoke with the polished confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own position in the world. He gave speeches about Southern honor and the natural order of civilization. He entertained governors. He corresponded with powerful men in Washington. He was, by every visible measure, the picture of Louisiana respectability. And he loved Charlotte in the way powerful men of that era loved their wives. She was to be admired, protected, and kept away from anything that might disturb her delicate sensibilities. Those were his exact words on their second evening together at the plantation. "You are not to concern yourself with the management of the workers," Edward told her gently over dinner, cutting his meat with precise, practiced strokes. "That is not your burden to carry." Charlotte had smiled and nodded. That was what was expected of her. But Charlotte Whitmore had not been raised to be entirely obedient. She had been raised to notice things. Her father, a merchant in Richmond, had always said that the most dangerous person in any room was not the loudest. It was the one paying attention. Charlotte paid attention. Within her first weeks at the plantation, she noticed things she was not supposed to notice. The way certain enslaved women would go silent and still when a particular set of boots came walking across the grounds. The way young girls, children really, would disappear from their usual tasks for days at a time and return thinner, quieter, as though something essential had been pulled out of them. The way the older women would pull those girls close and whisper things into their ears that never reached Charlotte's ears, no matter how near she stood. She noticed all of it, but she did not yet understand it. Not until the evening she was walking along the south side of the main house and heard a sound that stopped her completely in her tracks. Crying. Not the ordinary kind of crying, not the tired weeping of exhaustion or grief. This was a different sound entirely. Low, desperate, and almost animal in its rawness. The kind of crying that comes from a person who no longer believes that crying will help them, but cannot stop. Charlotte stood perfectly still. The sound was coming from behind the garden wall, near the old storage shed at the edge of the main yard. She took 3 steps toward it, then stopped herself. She turned back toward the house. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She sat at her vanity and stared at her own reflection for a long time. And then she whispered something to herself, barely audible, barely a breath at all. I heard nothing. That was the first lie Charlotte Bogard ever told herself.
It would not be the last. The weeks that followed were a slow education in the particular cruelties that polite society teaches women to unsee. Charlotte watched. She listened. She began, carefully and quietly, to ask small questions, not to the senator, not to the overseers, but to the enslaved women who worked inside the house, women like Dessa, who pressed Charlotte's dresses each morning without ever quite meeting her eyes, and Mamie, the older woman who ran the kitchen and seemed to carry the weight of the entire plantation on her shoulders without ever once letting it show. Charlotte asked gently, carefully, in the way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer will be terrible.
"Mamie," she said one afternoon, standing in the kitchen doorway while the older woman kneaded bread dough with her wide, powerful hands. "There was a girl I used to see near the south garden, a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, with the yellow headscarf. I haven't seen her in some time." Mamie's hands did not stop moving. "She been moved to the fields," Mamie said flatly. "Moved from housework to field work?" Charlotte frowned. "That seems unusual. She seemed so, Miss Charlotte."
Mamie finally looked up. Her eyes were steady and ancient and full of something that was not quite warning, not quite sorrow, but sat somewhere between the two.
"Some things on this plantation, they not yours to ask about." Charlotte stared at her. "Whose are they then?" she asked quietly. Mamie looked back down at her dough and said nothing. That silence was louder than any answer. It was around this same time that Charlotte began paying closer attention to the senator's younger brother, Caleb Bogard. Caleb was 31 years old, 5 years younger than Edward, and in nearly every way he was the darker reflection of his brother. Where Edward was measured, Caleb was impulsive. Where Edward performed dignity, Caleb wore his power like a bruise, constantly pressing against things to prove it was there.
He managed the day-to-day operations of the plantation while his brother attended to politics in Baton Rouge, and by all accounts, the enslaved workers feared him far more than they feared Senator Edward Bogard. Charlotte had always found Caleb unsettling in a way she struggled to name. He looked at her the wrong way, not with the usual condescension powerful men showed plantation wives, but with a particular kind of irritation, as though she was an inconvenient variable in an equation he had been successfully running for years. One evening at dinner, a quiet family meal, just the 3 of them plus Edward's elderly mother, Margaret, who sat at the end of the table and said very little, Charlotte made the mistake of mentioning the girl with the yellow headscarf. "I was only curious about her reassignment," Charlotte said, keeping her voice light and conversational. "She seemed well suited for housework." "I thought perhaps—"
"The allocation of workers is my domain," Caleb cut in without looking up from his plate. "Edward, would you pass the gravy?" Charlotte looked at her husband. Edward reached for the gravy and passed it across the table. That was it. That was the entirety of his response. Not a word of acknowledgement, not a glance in her direction. Just the quiet transfer of a gravy boat and the silent message it carried. This subject is closed. Charlotte pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate. At the far end of the table, old Margaret Bogard was watching her with calm, flat eyes. "Eat your supper, dear," the old woman said softly. It was the kindest silencing Charlotte had ever received, and somehow that made it worse. She ate her supper. But that night, lying in her bed while the summer heat pressed against the windows, Charlotte Bogard, made a decision. It was quiet, almost formless. Not yet a plan, not yet a vow. Just a small, firm thing that settled into place somewhere behind her sternum. She was going to pay attention, no matter what she saw, no matter what she heard, no matter how many times she was told to look the other way. She was going to pay attention. And in the weeks that followed, she did. She began rising early, before the rest of the main house stirred, and sitting by the window that faced the south yard, she watched the patterns of movement across the plantation. She noticed which cabins Caleb visited. She noticed which nights he walked back to the main house after midnight, pulling the collar of his coat up, even in the heat, moving quickly and quietly. She noticed the way the morning light on those particular days seemed to fall differently on the faces of the women moving between the cabins. Something tighter, something collapsed, like a wall that had been struck and not yet fully repaired. She kept a small journal. She wrote nothing incriminating in it, nothing that could be read and understood by anyone who found it, just small observations, dates, times, patterns. On the 3rd of August, 1847, Charlotte wrote 2 words in the journal. She underlined them twice. Then she closed the book, pressed it beneath her mattress, and stood at the window for a long time with her arms folded across her chest, staring out at the darkness of the plantation grounds. 15 days later, on the night of August 18th, she would not be standing at the window. She would be walking through it, toward the one place on that plantation she had been told again and again was not her place to go. And she would not be walking alone. She would be walking toward a truth so dark, so protected, so ferociously guarded by powerful men that the entire machinery of Louisiana society would be set in motion to bury it before the sun came up. The girl in the yellow headscarf was not in the fields. She had never been in the fields. And by the time Charlotte Bogard found her, it was already too late to pretend she hadn't. 3:02 a.m., August 18th, 1847. Charlotte's feet stopped moving the moment she crossed that threshold. Her hand was still gripping the doorframe, her lantern was still lit, and every single person inside that cabin, the women huddled in the corner, the girl pressed against the wall, Caleb Bogard standing in the center of the room, every single one of them turned and looked at her at the exact same moment. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt like 4 years. Then Caleb's face did something Charlotte had never seen it do before. It shifted, not into shame, not into guilt. It shifted into something cold and calculating, the way a man's face shifts when he is not caught doing something wrong, but is instead suddenly faced with a problem that needs to be managed. "Charlotte," he said. His voice was completely even. "You should not be here." She couldn't find her voice. She was staring past him at the girl crumpled against the far wall. The girl's headscarf, yellow, faded at the edges, was torn and hanging from her shoulder. Her lip was split. Her eyes were fixed on the floor with the particular vacancy of a person who has learned to send their mind somewhere else entirely, while their body remains behind. Charlotte had seen that girl before. She had written about her in the journal beneath her mattress. She found her voice. "What have you done to her?" Caleb took one step toward her. Just one. Measured and deliberate. "Lower your voice," he said. "What have you done? I said lower your voice." He was close to her now, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath and something else underneath it, something uglier. "You are standing in the slave quarters at 3 in the morning, Charlotte. Think very carefully about what that looks like." She stared at him. The threat was right there, naked and unashamed. He wasn't even bothering to hide it. "It looks like exactly what it is," she said. Her voice was shaking, but she kept it up. "It looks like a crime." 3:09 a.m. Caleb laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a dismissive laugh. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely could not conceive of consequences. The laugh of someone who had spent 31 years learning, slowly and thoroughly, that the rules of the world did not apply to him. A crime. He repeated the word like he was turning a coin over in his hand. Charlotte, listen to yourself.
You're a senator's wife standing barefoot in a slave cabin in the middle of the night. Who do you think they're going to believe? One of the women in the corner made a small, involuntary sound. Charlotte glanced at her. It was Dessa, the woman who pressed her dresses every morning. Dessa's eyes were wide and wet and full of something that was a mixture of terror and a desperate, impossible hope. Charlotte looked back at Caleb. "Step away from her," Charlotte said. He tilted his head. "Excuse me?" "I said, step away from that girl." For just a moment, just the briefest flicker of a moment, something moved across Caleb Bogard's face. Not respect, not fear. Something more dangerous than either. Recognition. He was recognizing for the first time that Charlotte was not going to be easily managed. That the variable he had dismissed for 6 years was suddenly more complicated than he had assumed. He stepped back from the girl. One step, as if it was his own idea. "There," he said. "Are you satisfied?" Charlotte moved past him before she had fully decided to do it. Her body acted before her mind caught up. She crossed the cabin floor and crouched down next to the girl. Up close, it was worse. There were bruises on the girl's arms that were not fresh. They were layered, old bruises beneath new ones, like rings inside a tree trunk, each one marking another time this had happened. Charlotte's chest tightened so sharply she almost couldn't breathe. "Can you stand?" she whispered to the girl. The girl said nothing. Her eyes didn't move. "Look at me," Charlotte said softly. "I need you to look at me." The girl's eyes slowly came up from the floor. They met Charlotte's. And what Charlotte saw in them, that deep, exhausted, completely unsurprised resignation, was the thing that finally broke something open inside her. Because that girl was not surprised that this had happened to her. She had expected it. She had been expecting it for a long time. That was when Charlotte understood, with her whole body and not just her mind, how long this had been going on. 3:17 a.m. "Get up and come with me," Charlotte said to the girl. "She's not going anywhere with you." Caleb's hand closed around Charlotte's upper arm and pulled her upright, not gently. His grip was tight and purposeful, the grip of a man reminding a woman exactly how much stronger he was. Charlotte did not pull away. She turned and looked directly at him. "Take your hand off me, Caleb. You need to walk out of this cabin right now and go back to the house," he said through his teeth. "And tomorrow morning, you are going to tell my brother that you had a nightmare and took a walk to clear your head. That is what happened tonight. That is the only thing that happened tonight. Let go of my arm, Charlotte. Let go." He released her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were burning. Behind him, Dessa had pulled the girl close, wrapping her arms around her, pressing the girl's face against her shoulder. The other women in the cabin were so still, they barely seemed to be breathing. Charlotte straightened her nightgown. She looked at Caleb for a long moment. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. "How many times?" she asked. Silence. "How many girls, Caleb?" "You need to stop talking." "How many girls on this plantation have you?" What happened next happened fast. 3:19 a.m. Caleb moved. Not with the measured deliberateness he had been using up to that point, but with sudden animal urgency. The lunge of a man who had calculated that the risk in front of him had just exceeded a threshold he was willing to tolerate. His hand shot out and grabbed Charlotte's lantern. He shoved her backward, hard. She went down. Her back hit the edge of a wooden cot,
and she folded sideways onto the floor, the air leaving her lungs in one sharp, involuntary gasp. For a moment, she was completely disoriented. The ceiling was above her. Someone was screaming. There was a sound of boots on wood. Dessa screamed. One of the other women screamed. The girl made no sound at all. Charlotte pushed herself up onto her hands, fighting for breath. Caleb was already at the door. "Nobody leaves this cabin," he said. His voice had gone completely flat. All the performance had drained out of it. What remained was something that had been underneath it all along, something that had no interest in pretending anymore. "If anyone walks through that door before sunrise, I will know, and every single one of you will be on a wagon to Texas before the week is out." He looked at Charlotte. "Including you," he said. Then he was gone. 3:24 a.m. The cabin went quiet. Miss Charlotte, you need to listen to me right now. You need to get up." Charlotte looked up at her. "He's going to Edward," Dessa said. "Right now. He's walking to the main house right now, and by the time you get there, the story already going to be written and you going to be in it the wrong way. You understand what I'm saying to you?" Charlotte understood. She got up. Her legs were unsteady. Her ribs ached. Her hand was bleeding. She got up anyway. "The girl," Charlotte said. "She has to come with me." Dessa shook her head fast. "You can't take her to the main house. They'll—" She stopped herself, swallowed. "They'll say she did something to you. They'll use her to explain why you're hurt. You go back to that house, Miss Charlotte. You go back right now, and you say what you saw. You say every single word of what you saw." Charlotte looked at the girl. The girl was watching her from the corner. Her eyes were clearer now, still devastated, still exhausted, but watching, taking Charlotte in with a focus that felt like more than survival. It felt like witnessing, like this girl was committing every detail of Charlotte's face to permanent memory, because she needed to believe that someone had finally come. Charlotte pressed her bleeding hand against her nightgown. "I'm coming back for you," she said. The girl said nothing. Charlotte said it again, quieter. More for herself than for anyone else. "I am coming back for you." She walked out of the cabin. The night air hit her like a wall. She crossed the dark yard toward the main house, moving fast, her white gown catching the faint moonlight. Somewhere ahead of her, she could see a lamp moving on the second floor, the amber glow of Caleb's lantern, already visible through the window of her husband's study. He was already there, already talking, already building the version of tonight that would replace the real one. Charlotte broke into a run. 3:31 a.m. She hit the front steps of the main house at a dead sprint and pushed through the door. The hallway was dark and still, but above her she could hear voices, 2 of them, low and rapid, coming from the study at the top of the stairs. She took the stairs 2 at a time. She reached the study door and pushed it open. Edward Bogard was sitting behind his desk in his dressing gown. Caleb stood across from him, hands behind his back, perfectly composed. Both men turned to look at her at the exact same moment. She stood in the doorway, breathing hard, hand bleeding, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at her husband. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Alone." Edward looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Charlotte. And in that look, in that single, loaded exchange between 2 brothers, Charlotte saw with absolute clarity what she was up against. Whatever Caleb had already said, Edward had already heard it. And from the expression on her husband's face, that careful, practiced blankness she had learned to read over 6 years, he had already decided to believe it. 3:33 a.m., August 18th, 1847. Edward Bogard looked at his wife the way a man looks at something that has become inconvenient. Not with cruelty, not even with anger. With that particular brand of southern composure that was somehow colder than either. the look of a man who has already organized the situation in his mind and is now simply waiting for the remaining pieces to fall into their assigned places. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "sit down." "I don't want to sit down." She was still standing in the doorway, still breathing hard. "I want Caleb to leave this room." Caleb didn't move. Edward glanced at his brother just once, barely a glance, more a flicker. And in that flicker was an entire conversation that Charlotte was not part of and had not been invited to. "Caleb," Edward said. "Edward, she's not in her right. Caleb, give us a moment." A pause. Then Caleb moved toward the door, slow and deliberate, brushing past Charlotte close enough that she could feel the air shift. He didn't look at her as he passed. That was the thing that frightened her most. A man who looked at you while threatening you was a man who still needed something from you. A man who stopped looking at you altogether had already decided you were no longer a factor worth addressing. The door closed behind him. Charlotte looked at her husband. "There is a girl in the south cabin," she said. "She has been beaten. There are bruises on her arms that go back weeks. Caleb was in that cabin tonight, and I saw—" "Charlotte." Edward's voice was gentle. That was the most terrible thing about it. It was genuinely, carefully gentle. The way you speak to someone you have already decided is not well. "Caleb told me you came outside in a state of distress, that you were disoriented, that you fell." She stared at him. "I didn't fall," she said. "He pushed me." Edward looked at her bleeding hand. Then he looked back at her face. "You should let the doctor look at that," he said. 3:41 a.m. There are moments in a marriage when a woman understands, with absolute and permanent clarity, exactly what kind of man she has married. Not the man who courts her, not the man who stands beside her at the altar, not even the man who sits across from her at 1,000 dinners, but the real man, the one who exists underneath all the performances. Charlotte understood it in that moment. She understood it in the careful gentleness of Edward's voice, in the way he had not once asked her what she had seen, in the way the only thing he seemed genuinely concerned about was the cut on her hand, because a cut on his wife's hand was a visible problem that could be explained and managed, while the truth she was carrying was neither. "Edward," she said quietly, "look at me." He looked at her. "That girl cannot have been older than 14 years old," she said. "And this was not the first time. I saw the bruises. I saw—" Her voice broke for just a moment. She pressed through it. "I saw Dessa's face. I saw how all of them looked. They have been living with this for years. And you are going to sit there and tell me you didn't know?" Something moved across Edward's face, fast, gone before it fully formed. But Charlotte saw it. It wasn't surprise. That was the twist that hit her like cold water, the realization that arrived not with a crash, but with a slow, nauseating certainty. He had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every night, but he had known the shape of it. He had chosen the shape of the lie that covered it. He had built his political career inside that lie, and furnished it, and lived comfortably within it. And he had brought Charlotte into it 6 years ago, and expected her to do the same. "How long have you known?" she asked. "You're exhausted," Edward said. "You're injured. This is not the time." "How long, Edward?" His jaw tightened. "There are matters on this plantation," he said slowly, choosing every word with the precision of a man diffusing something, "that are managed in ways you do not fully understand. The order of things here is not—" "The order of things." She repeated it back to him, and her voice had gone very quiet. "That is what you're calling it." He said nothing. "I am going back to that cabin," Charlotte said, "and I am bringing that girl into this house tonight." Edward stood up. "You will not," he said. It was the first time in 6 years of marriage that he had spoken to her in that register. Not a suggestion, not a gentle redirection, a flat, hard prohibition, a door slamming shut. Charlotte felt the shock of it move through her like electricity. Then she felt something else move in behind it, something that was not fear. 4 a.m. She was not able to go back to the cabin that night. Edward did not physically stop her. He did not need to. By the time Charlotte had pushed past him and reached the bottom of the stairs, there were already 2 overseers moving through the yard outside. She could see their lanterns from the front window. 4 points of amber light moving deliberately toward the south cabins. Caleb had not gone to bed. He had been outside the whole time, already deploying the machinery of erasure before the conversation upstairs had even ended. Before Charlotte had even opened her mouth to tell her husband what she had seen, the response to her seeing it was already in motion. She stood at the front window and watched the lanterns move. Her hand was still bleeding. She had forgotten about it entirely. Behind her, she heard Edward's footsteps on the stairs. He stopped several steps above her.
"Come away from the window," he said. She didn't move. "Charlotte, come away."
"Where are they taking her?" she asked. Silence. "Edward, where are they taking that girl?" "She'll be relocated to another property." His voice had returned to its managed, even tone. The emergency register was gone. The performance was back in place. "She'll be well cared for. You have my word." Charlotte turned and looked up at him. "Your word," she said. He held her gaze. She looked back out the window. The lanterns had stopped moving. 4:19 a.m. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair beside her bedroom window, with her bandaged hand folded in her lap and her journal open on the table beside her. And she did not write a single word in it. She just sat. She listened to the plantation settle into its false quiet around her. She listened to Caleb's boots cross the downstairs hallway sometime around 4 in the morning. She listened to Edward's chamber door click shut. She listened to the absolute, suffocating silence that followed, the silence of a household that had successfully closed ranks around a terrible thing and was now simply waiting for morning to arrive so the normal pretenses could resume. At some point, just before dawn, she heard something else. It was faint. So faint, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. It was a woman's voice, somewhere outside in the yard below. Low and rhythmic, almost like a song, but not quite. More like the sound a person makes when they are trying to comfort someone beyond comforting. A sound that rose and fell, and had no words Charlotte could make out, only a tone that she felt in the back of her throat and behind her eyes. She pressed her forehead against the window glass. She could not see who it was. By the time the first gray light of morning came, the voice was gone. And so was the girl. 6 a.m. The August 19th, 1847. The plantation doctor arrived before breakfast. His name was Harlan Reeves, and he had been the Bogard family physician for 11 years. He was a small, fastidious man who smelled of camphor and kept his opinions arranged in the same careful order as his medical instruments, accessible only when specifically requested, and otherwise kept firmly out of sight. He examined Charlotte's hand, redressed the cut, listened to her breathing, and took her pulse. Then he sat back and looked at her with the particular professional neutrality of a man who has been told exactly what to find and is now performing the act of finding it. "You've had quite an episode," he said. "An episode," Charlotte repeated. "Exhaustion, possible fever." He opened his bag. "I'm going to prescribe a course of rest. I'd recommend staying in your rooms for at least 3 days. Avoid Dr. Reeves." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "Do you have a daughter?" He paused. "I do," he said carefully. "How old is she?" A longer pause. 15, he said. Charlotte nodded slowly. "Last night I saw a girl approximately her age," Charlotte said, "who had been beaten repeatedly over an extended period of time. I want that documented in your medical report." Harlan Reeves closed his bag. He did not look at her. "Mrs. Bogard," he said quietly, "I strongly encourage you to rest." He stood, picked up his bag, and left the room without looking back. 8:30 a.m. By mid-morning, Charlotte understood the full architecture of what was being built around her. Dessa did not come to press her dresses that morning. A different woman came, one Charlotte had never seen before, who moved through the room quickly and said nothing. When Charlotte asked where Dessa was, the woman said she didn't know, and the steadiness with which she delivered that lie confirmed that she had been coached to deliver it. At breakfast, Edward sat at his usual place and read his correspondence as though the previous night had been an ordinary one. He asked Charlotte how her hand felt. He commented on the heat. He mentioned that he had business in Baton Rouge later in the week. Caleb did not appear at breakfast at all. Charlotte ate in silence. Then she excused herself, went upstairs, pulled her journal from beneath her mattress, and began writing. Not in the careful, coded language she had been using. In plain language, full sentences, dates, times, names, every detail she could recall from the night before, written in clear, unambiguous words that left nothing open to interpretation. She wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she read it back to herself once. Then she folded the pages carefully, pressed them flat, and hid them in a place that was not beneath the mattress, a place she had identified weeks ago during one of her early morning vigils, a place that even Edward's most thorough search of the room would be unlikely to reach. She was not naive enough to believe those pages would protect her, but she believed, with a conviction that surprised her with its fierceness, that they needed to exist, that somewhere in the future, some morning far beyond her own, someone needed to be able to find them. Outside her window, she heard the sound of wagons. She did not go to look. She already knew what the wagons meant. By nightfall, every witness from the south cabin would be gone. August 19th, 1847, 2 p.m. The wagons left before noon. Charlotte heard them from her room. She counted the sounds, the creak of wood, the snap of reins, the low murmur of voices being kept deliberately below the level of words. She sat completely still in her chair and listened until the sounds faded into the distance and the plantation went quiet again. That particular quiet. The kind that isn't peace, but is the absence of everything that was alive. Dessa was gone. The other women from the cabin were gone. The girl with the yellow headscarf was gone. By 2 o'clock, Charlotte had stopped crying. Not because the grief had passed, but because it had settled into something harder and more permanent. The kind of sorrow that doesn't move through you and leave, but instead finds a place inside you and builds a wall. She stood up, smoothed her dress, walked downstairs. Edward was in his study. She could hear him dictating a letter to his secretary through the closed door. Something about a land agreement, something about harvest estimates, the ordinary business of a powerful man's ordinary afternoon. She stood outside his door for a moment. Then she kept walking. She went out the back of the house, across the yard, and down the path toward the south cabins. The overseers saw her. She knew they saw her. She kept walking anyway. Let them watch. Let them report back. She no longer particularly cared what they reported. The cabin was empty when she reached it. She pushed the door open and stood in the doorway. Inside, someone had swept the floor and straightened the cots and removed every visible trace of what had happened the night before. The only thing that remained was a small piece of yellow cloth caught on a nail near the baseboard. A scrap from the girl's headscarf, left behind in the hurry of erasure. Charlotte crouched down and pulled it free. She held it in her palm for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket and walked back to the main house. 2:47 p.m. She did not confront Edward again that day, or the day after. She did something more dangerous than confrontation. She waited. She watched. She continued attending meals, continued managing the household, continued performing every visible aspect of her role as the senator's wife with the same grace and composure that had always been expected of her. But underneath that performance, she was building something. She had no allies inside the plantation, that much was clear. Every person who had witnessed the night of August 18th had been dispersed across 3 states before the sun set on August 19th. Edward had moved with the efficiency of a man who had contingency plans for exactly this kind of emergency, which told Charlotte something she had already suspected, that this was not the first time the Bogard family had needed to contain a situation of this nature. The sheriff came on the morning of August 20th. His name was Archibald Pruitt, a heavy-set man with small eyes and the particular easy confidence of someone who has spent years being paid to ask the questions he has already been given the answers to. Charlotte was present when Edward met with him in the front parlor. Edward had not asked her to be there. She had simply walked in and sat down, and neither man had been willing to make the scene that asking her to leave would have required. Sheriff Pruitt looked at her once, briefly, then directed all of his questions at Edward. "Understand, there was some disturbance on the property 2 nights past," Pruitt said, his pen hovering over his notebook with the theatrical readiness of a man who intends to write very little. "My wife was unwell," Edward said. "She walked in her sleep. One of the workers found her, and there was some confusion in the dark. She fell and injured her hand." Pruitt nodded slowly. His pen did not move. "That right, Mrs. Bogard?" he said, glancing at her with those small eyes. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about Dessa, about the girl, about the scrap of yellow cloth in her bureau drawer. She thought about what would happen if she spoke the truth in this room, to this man, in this parish, in this year. She thought about it for 4 full seconds. "That's what my husband told me happened," she said. It was the most precise truth she could deliver. It was not a confirmation. It was not a denial. It was a sentence that Sheriff Archibald Pruitt would hear as agreement, and that Charlotte could live with as something other than a lie. Pruitt wrote something in his notebook, probably nothing. He left 20 minutes later. His report, filed the same afternoon, described the incident as a domestic medical episode, requiring no further investigation. 2 days after that, the report disappeared from the parish records entirely, removed by a clerk whose name nobody seemed to remember. August 25th, 1847, 9 a.m. The thing about a secret that powerful men bury is that it does not rest quietly. It shifts. It presses upward against the ground above it. It finds the hairline cracks in the foundation and works its way into them slowly, over months and years, until the weight of keeping it buried becomes its own kind of destruction. Charlotte felt it happening to her in real time. She stopped sleeping well. She stopped eating at the table with any interest in the food in front of her. She moved through the days with a mechanical precision that Edward seemed to interpret as acceptance, and that was, in reality, the closest thing to survival she could manage. She thought about the girl constantly. She invented futures for her, told herself the girl had been taken somewhere safer, somewhere the Bogard name didn't reach, somewhere she could grow older than 14 without the weight of what had already been done to her, crushing everything that came after. She knew these were fictions, but she needed them to get through the days. What she did not invent and could not push away was the memory of Dessa's eyes. Dessa had looked at Charlotte in that cabin with something that was almost hope, and Charlotte had walked out and written in a journal and sat silently across from a sheriff while he performed the procedure of not investigating and done nothing that resulted in anything changing. That was the thing that lived in her chest now, not the horror of what she had witnessed. the horror of what she had been unable to stop. September 3rd, 1847. Twist. On the 3rd of September, Charlotte received a visitor. She was not expected, and Charlotte had not been told she was coming. She simply appeared at the front door one morning while Edward was in Baton Rouge. A small, older woman, in plain dark clothing, with a calm, watchful face and hands that were folded in front of her with the precise stillness of someone who has spent a long time learning to make herself appear harmless. Her name was Sister Augustine.
She was a Catholic nun from a small mission outside Baton Rouge, and she had come, she said quietly, to call on Mrs. Bogard. Charlotte's first instinct was to turn her away. Her second instinct, sharper and more insistent, told her not to. She brought Sister Augustine inside. They sat in the back parlor, away from the windows facing the yard. "How did you know to come here?" Charlotte asked. Sister Augustine folded her hands more tightly.
"A woman came to our mission 2 weeks ago," she said. "She had been traveling from this parish. She was in some distress." A pause. "She asked me to find you." Charlotte's heart stopped. "What woman?" she said. "She asked me not to use her name," Sister Augustine said, "but she described you very clearly. She said you came into a dark place and tried to help someone who needed it. She said you were the only one who tried." Charlotte's throat tightened so sharply she almost couldn't speak. "Is she safe?" she said. "The girl, is she—" "I don't know about any girl," Sister Augustine said carefully. "The woman who came to me, the adult woman, she is safe. She is outside this parish and she is safe." Dessa. It was Dessa. Charlotte pressed her bandaged hand flat against the arm of her chair and breathed. "She said something else," Sister Augustine continued. Her voice had dropped lower. "She said you wrote things down. She said you kept a record." Charlotte went very still. "She said that record matters," Sister Augustine said. "She said people need to know. Not now, perhaps, but someday." 10 a.m. Charlotte looked at the nun for a long time. "If I give you something," she said slowly, "can you keep it somewhere that Edward Bogard cannot reach?" Sister Augustine met her eyes without flinching. "I have kept things that far more powerful men than your husband wished to destroy," she said simply. Charlotte stood, walked upstairs, retrieved the folded pages from their hiding place. The full account she had written on the morning of August 19th, plain language, full names, every detail intact. She came back downstairs and held them out. Sister Augustine took them with both hands, carefully, as if she understood exactly what she was holding. "One more thing," Charlotte said. "There was a girl, 14 years old, yellow headscarf. She was taken from this plantation on the morning of August 19th.
She would have been sent to Texas or Mississippi or Arkansas." Her voice was steady, but it cost her everything to keep it that way. "If you ever hear anything, if anyone ever comes to you who knows where she is, I need to know she survived." Sister Augustine looked at her for a moment. "I will ask," she said. "I cannot promise." "I know," Charlotte said. "Ask anyway." The nun left. Charlotte stood at the window and watched her go. She did not hear from Sister Augustine again for 11 months. When the letter finally came, it contained 4 words and no signature. "She grew up fine." Charlotte read those 4 words standing in the same back parlor where she had handed over the pages. She read them 3 times. Then she folded the letter, pressed it against her chest, closed her eyes, and stood there for a long time in the quiet. Years, 1847 to 1887. The decades that followed did their work on everyone. Edward Bogard served 2 more terms in the Louisiana State Senate and retired to considerable public honor in 1861, just as the world he had built his career defending began to collapse around him. He died in 1869 at the age of 63, remembered in the parish newspaper as a statesman of principle and a devoted family man. Caleb Bogard was never charged with any crime. He managed the plantation until the end of the war, then moved north and disappeared from the historical record entirely. There are no letters from him in the Bogard family archive, no photographs, no death record that has ever been conclusively identified. He simply ceased to be documented, as though history itself had quietly agreed to stop paying attention to him. Charlotte Bogard lived until 1884. In her later years, the servants said she spent long evenings walking alone on the grounds near where the south cabins had once stood, the cabins that had been torn down and rebuilt as storage sheds after the war. They said she walked slowly and that sometimes she stopped and stood very still in particular spots, as if listening to something in the ground beneath her feet. She never spoke publicly about the night of August 18, 1847, but she spoke about it once to a priest in Baton Rouge named Father Lemaire in the final year of her life. She told him everything. She told him about the girl, about Dessa, about Sister Augustine and the folded pages and the 4-word letter. She told him what she had seen in that cabin and what she had failed to stop, and what had happened to every person who had been present. Father Lemaire kept her confidence until 1891, 7 years after Charlotte's death. Then, at 72 years old, and believing he did not have much longer, he sat down with a young journalist from New Orleans and talked for 3 hours. He said Charlotte Bogard had told him that the worst thing she had ever done in her life was not the night she walked into that cabin. It was the morning after, when she sat in a parlor across from a sheriff and stayed quiet. She had spent the rest of her life, Father Lemaire said, trying to decide whether the 4 words in that letter were enough to balance that silence. He did not think she ever decided. The journalist published a small account in a regional paper. It was largely ignored. The Bogard family, by then scattered and diminished, made no response. But the pages that Charlotte had pressed into Sister Augustine's hands in September of 1847 survived. They passed through the mission's records, then to a church archive in New Orleans, then, after a fire in 1903 destroyed much of that archive, they were believed lost. Until 1922, when a researcher sorting through water-damaged documents in a storage room found a packet of folded pages wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting was faded but legible. The account was precise and unambiguous. At the top of the first page, in Charlotte Bogard's careful hand, was a single line that she had written and underlined twice. It read, "So that someone knows. Someone always does in the end." The Mississippi River could not keep this secret. Nothing ever could.